Welcome once again to our study of Jamgön Mipham, his life and teachings. I'm sorry, couldn't make it last week. Wasn't feeling so well, but all good and back on track. I'd like to say I'm very happy that we're here and studying this particular work, spending some time, not just about Jamgön Mipham, but also getting a context. The larger picture of the teaching, how it's come down to us. And Douglas Duckworth is very good in the sense of presenting what is really relevant for us, because we could, of course, have a lot of detail around the history and so forth in terms of the eras of Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. But what we're very interested in is the themes that touch us in terms of our practice. And this is where this text here, and also some of other, well, in general, actually, Professor Duckworth's writings are very, very helpful in terms of us making sense of what we practice as practitioners on the path. So I'm very happy that we're having a look at this text. So we begin with invoking Jamgön Mipham. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of courage, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. By the way, in case you were wondering, the D up in the right-hand corner, the calligraphy up in the right-hand corner, is executed by Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche. And if I'm not wrong, you can actually purchase this calligraphy, the print of the calligraphy from Lotus Outreach. I hadn't actually planned on saying that, but just as an aside, you can get this through Lotus Outreach. So, and of course, the reason why this D is there is because D is the seed syllable of Manjushri. And we very often actually, we see in the writings of Jamgön Mipham where it just says written by D, in the sense of originating from, you could say, the wisdom expanse of D, the wisdom expanse of Manjushri. So I just wanted to, the other day I was looking in the autobiography of Dinghu Chenze Rinpoche, and in there he actually writes, whenever I teach or study the Dharma, I still feel that the little understanding I have reached or achieved is due to the kindness of Mipham Rinpoche, who was Manjushri in person. I have gained certainty about that. I pay homage to Manjushri, whose kindness led to my virtuous attitude. I also pay homage to the spiritual teachers, whose kindness made me progress. Just like these words of Shantideva, as soon as I was born, I met Manjushri in human form, and he took care of me without being asked, which could be considered the core of my life story. This is quite significant. This is no exaggeration. When Rinpoche speaks about this being the core of his life story, it is that core of awakening which he attributes to the meeting with Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche. There is an event that Rinpoche would refer to in terms of his life, and that is a Manjushri empowerment he received from Mipham Rinpoche when he was very young. So we don't know the exact details, or maybe some people do, but this was very significant for Rinpoche. And of course, as we all know, Rinpoche was blessed by Jamgön Mipham when he was still in his mother's womb and received his name Tashi Paljo, Mangala Shri Bhuti, from Jamgön Mipham at that time. So Jamgön Mipham is very significant for us. We need to acknowledge this, and for all the reasons that are now following. Now, last time we didn't complete chapter 2, And essentially in chapter 2, we're talking about the 3 turnings of the wheel. So these are the basic teachings of the Four Noble Truths, and then the teachings on you could say the ultimate nature of reality from the point of view of its lack of inherent existence. This is where where Buddhas and sentient beings say the dividing line is whether or not we understand that phenomena cannot be grasped. And that's where the Buddha then taught the teachings on shunyata, the prajnaparamita, which are then the teachings on emptiness. The third turning of the wheel are what you could say the vast countless qualities that arise from this awakened nature that realizes emptiness, the wisdom itself, Buddha nature. And so the second and third turning, they are generally viewed as, particularly from Longchenpa and also from Nipa Rinpoche's position, teachings, they're both equally viewed as the definitive teachings. One speaks about, you could say, the ontological aspect, how phenomena cannot be grasped. The other talks more about the phenomenology or the manifestation, the experience that arises out of that, namely the subjective dimension of awakening or Buddha nature. So in this way, these the second and third turning of the wheel are seen as actually being in harmony. And this is one of the important teachings of Longchenpa and also Mipham Rinpoche. So let's look at these as they were taught. Particularly the teachings on the Prajnaparamita, Madhyamaka, and so on came down from Nagarjuna. And then we'll look at how the teachings on Buddha nature, what we call the vast practice lineage, or the vast qualities of awakening and Buddha nature manifest. And this is then very much the scope of the Yogacarya teaching. So when we talk about the lineage of the profound view, what is profound is that this is what looks down at the very nature of reality. So that's essentially the view. And Nagarjuna, Arya Nagarjuna, is someone then who clarified these teachings. Of course, these are all the Buddha's teachings, but it was particularly Nagarjuna that really made sure that these teachings were not lost. There was a lot of, you could say, there is an incredible heritage of the Buddha's teaching, and it was really thanks to Nagarjuna that really the main point, the most important point really of understanding this nature of emptiness was properly understood. So to this day, Nagarjuna's unparalleled writings on the middle way attract attention. And that's sort of an understatement. They're foundational to the view of all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but they're also very much something that has attracted the attention by Western philosophers, particularly in the 20th century, particularly in the context of the idea of deconstruction. And essentially, you could say this sort of radical skepticism that is sort of a recurring theme in Western philosophy. Nagarjuna's original writings generated later commentators. We notably have the likes of Buddhapalita and also the likes, well, we have quite a few, but let's begin with Buddhapalita. And when we speak about Buddhapalita, he is identified with what we call the Prasangika school or the consequent school. Now, this is actually a Tibetan way of classifying Buddhapalita. Buddhapalita really emphasized the view of Nagarjuna, how nothing can be grasped. And he did so not so much from explaining it from the point of view of analysis, but really just from the point of view of refuting any position, basically dismantling philosophy. If you like, the philosophy to end all philosophies, just proving how the conceptual mind always inevitably operates within a circular logic. Now, there was someone called Bhaviveka who said that's all very good, but you need to be able to explain to people. You need to be able to, people might not get that. We need to explain that to people. And he was a little bit critical of Buddhapalita and, say, the pedagogy. Of course, he agreed with Buddhapalita, but you could say the methodology he disagreed somewhat with. And then we have later someone called Chandrakirti who came to the defense of Buddhapalita and very much criticized by Viveka. So there was a little bit of squabbling going on, but in a way, these kind of discussions back and forth, they really enable us to identify important points. One is Buddhapalita's incredible brilliance in making sure that you're basically using words to undermine words, using language to eliminate language. Very important point. By Viveka, then use language, and that's what we refer to as Svatantra or Rangyu, autonomy, are those that actually make statements. For example, stating how, well, particularly his logic was that what we call the reasoning of neither singular nor plural, but essentially you could say analyzing phenomena and seeing they have no inherent existence. And I think last time we looked both at the example of a hand and also the example of a pile, and essentially identifying how such phenomena are essentially just designations. But Viveka used logic, sort of made points, and as such, you could say there's still a subtle attachment to the phenomena. Anyway, these two schools then are what the Tibetans refer to as the Prasangika and the Svatantrika approaches, and then they're actually given the name schools, but they're not really schools in the sense that these people, Buddhapalita and Bhaviveka, they founded them, but it's rather later, the later usage and the later application of their approach, which is then referred to as Prasangika and Svatantrika. So the consequence school, they show the absurd consequence of asserting true existence. So if, for example, you assert that a God is a creator, and as such, God permeates everything, then you're basically denying that there's a difference between cause and effect. And Buddhapalita's logic would say, well, if you see no difference between cause and effect, why do you prefer food over excrement? And that's where you could say, with just saying that, he didn't actually make a position himself, rather expose the flaw of this belief in the inseparability of cause and effect and so forth. It's not just being the smart aleck, but it's very much showing the flaw of the conceptual mind. So the autonomy school, they make assertions about the nature of emptiness. They would say, for example, well, all phenomena, they arise as, you could say, designations on the basis of perception, and they would make statements that are more, you could say, analytical. And particularly also the autonomy school, they very much operate with the notion of the two truths. And so they would very much emphasize that you have one understanding on the basis of relative truth, one understanding on the level of absolute truth. And while, of course, the consequence on Prasangika school were not ignorant about the two truths, their point was really just to, you could say, eliminate any conceptual constructs. So we generally refer to the autonomy school as being a bit gentler. As far as Madhyamika goes, they both, their ultimate understanding is identical, but their approach is a bit gentler. So in Tibet, the consequence school came to be regarded as the highest view. And of course, yes, how could it not? It's simply the one that is, you could say, unparalleled in its approach, undermining any conceptual construct. So Douglas Duckworth says the consequence school draws on a radically deconstructive form of argument to shred any and all notions regarding what reality is. The central insight of the school is that any attempt to pin down or determine reality is always only a conceptual construct. Now then we have the Yogacarya tradition, which is then the lineage of vast activity. And here then the vastness refers to all the various qualities of enlightenment, and the Yogacarya approach, which comes from Asanga and Maitreya, very much are the ones who map, you could say, all the aspects and the phenomenology of samsara, nirvana, and the path. So in general, by the way, Nagarjuna, I forgot, probably somewhere else I mentioned it, is we would say 2nd century Common Era and Asanga 4th century Common Era. Transmitted the 5 Dhammas of Maitreya. I think many are familiar with the story of Asanga meditating, waiting to have a vision of Maitreya, and sort of whenever he then leaves his retreat frustrated, he runs into something that sort of shames him, makes him realize he should be more patient. Like the man whose house is being shaded by a mountain, so he's up on top of the mountain with a feather, saying, "I'm just wearing down the mountain so the sun will come shine on my house." So Asanga went, "Wow, this man has patience. I better get back and pursue my practice with a comparable degree of patience." So eventually he did have a vision of Maitreya and received teachings from Maitreya. And one of these is what we call the Uttara Tantra, or the Mahayana Uttara Tantra Shastra, the Sublime Continuum, which is then what Samasa Khensa Rinpoche taught in Australia and elsewhere for a number of years. And this is about the qualities of enlightenment. So Maitreya's 5 Dhammas, they clarify then particularly the 3rd turning of the wheel and the nature of the mind. Sometimes we refer to, I remember Trungpa Rinpoche, he would refer to the 3rd turning of the wheel as the wheel of luminosity. So this is then the nature of mind that is clarified in the 3rd turning of the wheel. Now, this is what we call then the yogic practice school, the Yogacara school, that highlights then the mind's role in terms of constructing reality. So the point really is, where do all our perceptions come from? Well, from the Yogacara perspective, they come from the mind. There's actually nothing that has any reality as such, except just we have projections. Now, this does not fall into what we in Western philosophy refer to as the extreme of solipsism, which means we're all alone. If it's all in my mind, then there's nobody else except me. That's not necessarily the case. We have a lot of others around us, but we're sharing. We have a shared perception. We have shared similar projections, if you like. That's where we then have this experience of a shared world out there. But again, it applies just like we apply right from the start in terms of the other philosophies we looked at, the Vaibhashika and Suchantika. It applies that if we analyze, we come up essentially with nothing that can be grasped. So the Yogacara school then, with essentially its investigation into how the mind operates and in its confused condition, in its unconfused condition, and also on the path, they very much emphasize the experience, the personal experience that we have. And as such, they formulated an elaborate phenomenology and elaborate teaching on the ways that we run into confusion, the way how confusion manifests, and the way we can extract ourselves from confusion, and how in the absence of confusion, the qualities that are associated with that. So we could say that Asanga's tradition primarily deals with how things appear, our experience. Nagarjuna's tradition primarily deals with the way things are, what we actually need to know, and of course what we are uncovering in the process of the path. In Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche's view, these 2 lineages of Nagarjuna and Sangha complement each other. Sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, there would be a little bit of sort of emphasis, there's a sort of hierarchies of, you could say, the Madhyamaka is higher than Yogacarya as such. And that leads to then assuming that the Yogacarya is no good. That's not the case. And in fact, everybody, the Madhyamikas and all the schools, they would use the various, you could say, models of explanation that you find in, say, the Yogacarya, in the Sutrantika, in the Vaibhashika. But nevertheless, there would be sometimes the notion that some was still what we call expedient teachings, and other were definitive teachings. And the point really that Jamgön Mipham makes is that these 2, the 2nd and 3rd turning of the wheel, associated with these 2 lineages of Nagarjuna and Sangha, they equally are what we call definitive teaching. Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche in general is very good in seeing the unity of the various views. All the various traditions he finds very helpful. And this is very basic to then what we call the remade perspective, which is appreciating, not just mixing it all into one big soup as such, that you just end up with one teaching. But Rime really just is the respect for the individual qualities of the various lineages and the various approaches. And so Mipham Rinpoche was really defined in his very gentle appreciation, and also even where Mipham Rinpoche was sometimes refuting others, he would do so in a very polite and playful way. I think we mentioned last time how he ended up having some great friendships with those with whom he debated. Now, so we've talked about the Madhyamaka, and the Yogacarya, the two lineages. And also what's very important for Mipham Rinpoche, because we're mainly here looking at, you could say, important teachings for Mipham Rinpoche, is then the Abhidharma. And the Abhidharma are the teachings that describe then the way in which the mind experiences. And it's also there where we have the teachings on all the mental events, we have the teachings on the 5 skandhas and so forth. So the Abhidharma teaching, they constitute the third basket from the Buddha's teachings. We have the basket of the Vinaya, teachings on discipline. We have the basket of the Sutra teachings, the spiritual advice from the Buddha. And then we have the teachings on the Abhidharma, which are then the more specific teachings on, it's more the science of the Buddha in terms of understanding mind and phenomena. So we also there have teachings on cosmology and so forth. All of that, you could say, very much, of course, concordant with the Indian view on the universe at the time. But particularly what's important is then the teachings on things like the skandhas, the dhatus and ayatanas. And this is also something that becomes very relevant in Vajrayana, because that's where we incorporate the pure aspect of that on the path. So with the teachings on pure perception, for example, we are operating with the basic Abhidharma teachings on how we understand ourselves and our world. Abhidharma analysis dissects phenomena and experience, dismantling the belief in the solid self. This is very basic to the understanding of the 5 skandhas and so on. And ultimate reality are seen then as the irreducible particles and moments of consciousness that make things. Now, this is where the Abhidharma is associated with the Vibhashika and Sutandika traditions. And that is where we understand phenomena as existing as just unitary particles on the outer phenomenal world, and also as far as experience goes, then these single moments of experience, moments of consciousness. And that is all, what we, again, very often we talk about these moments of experience, right? We very often say to our friends, if they're upset about something, we would say, let it go. And we can see that what we do when we're upset, for example, or fixated on something, is that we take an idea from one moment to the next, to the next, to the next, and we're actually sustaining moments of consciousness. But they're actually not inseparably bound together. They're individual moments of consciousness, and that's also why we can let go of them. That's why we practice meditation. So that's where it's an understanding of essentially these moments of consciousness are, very often referred to just like we have a mala, and we can see how these are, while it's one mala, it is in fact made up of 108 or 11 beads. Anyway, here then Duckworth, he compares this understanding of what we also very often have, of what we were brought up with, the idea of atoms, right? That everything is made up of irreducible units, and that's sort of something that is in some way a theme in Seurat's famous picture, the Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. And that's where we have this technique that he uses, which are these dots. This is something that many of you probably seen this before, but anyway, if this painting here is essentially the technique the painter Seurat has used are these individual dots, and that's actually how we could say all our perceptions are. But this is very interesting because that painting actually highlights where if you just glance at it, you just have a picture of a solid reality. But if you come close, then you can actually see how it's just dots and dots. And so that's how we should understand reality. It's one way of understanding the Abhidharma perspective. So Duckworth says, in a Buddhist context, an important function of this analysis is to overcome mistaken notions of reality, particularly the mistaken concept of a self. The self is a misidentification of what we really experience, because what we interpret to be a self is actually the five aggregates: form, feeling, perceptions, formations, and consciousness. Upon investigating experience, there is no self to be found. There are only these aggregates. Each of them is also multiple and momentary. Since our body, feelings, and mental states are constantly changing, there is no singular and lasting self within this effervescent flow of experience. Thus, a singular and enduring self, or anything like it, does not exist other than a mere imputation. So that's again where we come back to this, like we impute a hand as being a unit, we impute a pile of sand as being a unit, but in fact it is just a designation. That's where we go wrong. And that's where analysis is essential to really understand there is nothing that is unchanging, the way that we attribute solidity to it. A very important point. And this, of course, runs as a theme through all of Buddhism. So this is, you could say, the Buddha's lion's roar, this teaching on dependent origination, the teaching on emptiness. And then again, of course, what we have in the different philosophical schools are varying degrees of understanding this emptiness, this lack of solidity. Abhidharma identifies how our mind asserts self and phenomena and critiques that assumption. So it's not just that when we come to the Dharma, we're supposed to get rid of a self. We're actually encouraged to go in and say, is there really a self? I mean, if there is a self, then by all means, hold on to it, you know. But the thing is, if we look, there's not. So it's not just about being a good boy or girl or having a sort of particular ethical philosophy, but it's really just about actually seeing. It's a hoax. There's nothing there. The ascending views of the yogic practice school and middle way offer even more in-depth critiques, and that's where, when we mean ascending views, is that they become increasingly subtle. And that's where the yogic practice school, in addition to understanding that there's that phenomena made up of, in fact, just particles and moments of consciousness, they analyze even deeper and saying, well, even these so-called particles, they're really just designations. They're not really, there's nothing really there. Similar moments of consciousness, there's nothing ultimately there either. And the middle way, they would go as far as saying even that mind that knows this designation, that also has no reality. So there's an increasing in-depth critique that takes place with regards to these views, where the middle way obviously is the view then in which we relinquish any kind of subtle reference point. So the Abhidharma, oh, there you go, sorry. The Abhidharma then, together with the yogic practice school, explain the presence of appearances. So that's where the Abhidharma is quite helpful in terms of us making sense out of appearances. And this is where it's quite helpful for the modern person who's been brought up with physics and so on, that sort of operates. Very often we, even as Buddhists, you know, we don't really revise our understanding of appearances. We have some idea of emptiness, but the sort of the way that appearances work, we very often just stick with the way we were taught. And that's not very helpful, because that generally entails what we can call a sort of materialist nihilism. And so that's where it's very helpful for us really to understand the Abhidharma and yogic practice school explanations on how the perceptions that we have, how they actually exist. So in the case of both the Abhidharma and yogic practice schools, they break down our distorted constructions of reality, and they present a theory of what really actually is. So one is it eliminates our confusion, and it also points to the nature of reality. It points to the vipassana of greater freedom, greater openness, the dimensions of shunyata. So the yogic practice school is something which, and again, this is very important for the Mipham, and we will see, because sometimes, like I said, there's a hierarchy in Tibetan Buddhism where we would say Jamgön is the highest, yogic practice school is lesser, but Mipham makes a big point about how valuable actually the yogic practice school is for the reasons that I was just stating. So about this Yogacarya school, it describes reality in terms of our experience, our consciousness as the ontological foundation. And that is where the yogic practice school actually would say awareness, this reflexive awareness, is then held as being absolute. That is where sometimes there's a bit of discussion taking place. Their view is that mind is all there is. There is nothing outside mind, as in a dream. So this is something we also have in Western philosophy. For example, the idealists such as Bishop Berkeley or Bertrand Russell and so on, where there is the understanding, not falling into an extreme of solipsism like I described before, but really just understanding that it's really just mind that creates everything. I remember as a teenager reading Hesse's Steppenwolf. In there, actually, there's a what's it called again? Treatise for Madmen, I think it's called. And in there, there's the main character Harry is introduced to how everything he experiences is in fact just his own mind. A little bit on the trippy side, but at the same time, this is a view that's quite prevalent within philosophy, and certainly within the Buddhist teaching. We identify how everything goes through our particular consciousness. It is the primary, you could say, empirical dimension of our reality. Everything that we construct in terms of knowledge about, you could say, what's out there, is essentially constructed by the consciousness. So as far as us, you could say, gaining a proper understanding of our reality, it's essential that we understand the one that is developing that understanding, the subject, the consciousness. And so that's why we understand the primacy in terms of everything that we experience is really this mind. So it says then, after all, we see objects, not fields of particles. So that's right. We know from physics that everything that's out there is particles, and yet we are projecting particular images, designations, labels onto our phenomena. And we share this with others. But if we analyze, then we can see this is nothing but particles. Particles, again, are designations and so forth. That's, again, where we can, on a very sort of immediate level, see that we are, in fact, projecting and solidifying these projections. So our mental dispositions, they shape our positions. And this then reinforces our habits. On the basis of this so-called reality, we have our particular inclinations. I like this, I don't like that, and so forth. And this shapes the way that we interact with the world. This becomes the basis for our habits and karma. Objects cannot be known without a consciousness that knows them. So we can never get away from consciousness. So that's why this primacy of mind is fundamental to all of Buddhism. All of Buddhism is understood how confusion and the end of confusion entirely is contingent on us handling this mind. The practice school, they then assert this mind as ultimate. They would say this mind that is either creates confusion or is free of confusion, that you could say naked mind that knows itself, that is ultimate. So we have this bit, and also Duckworth goes into that, similar to Western idealism, nothing exists outside of perception. So the yogic practice school are all about the nature of experience as opposed to the objective nature. So it's more about what we call phenomenology rather than ontology. It's more about the experience rather than looking at, you know, we could say, what is this truly made up of, you know? We're more interested in the one who's, you know, and this, of course, very often is the sort of foundation for our idea of a nerd. Again, someone who's just actually is completely unconscious about themselves, but very much sort of caught up in just data and you could say objectivist data about phenomena, whatever, however it plays out. It's sort of the distracted professor type who is actually divorced from feeling and actually just caught up in data. So this is where the yogic practice school is so much about this dimension. Of course, the other dimension is important too, to really understand reality. Of course, goes without saying. Anyway, as far as experience goes, samsara, nirvana, and the path, then we, in the yogic practice school, speak about three natures. This is a biggie, really. And there's also something that, yeah. So we have on here this graph. This is actually yeah, so this graph here is actually something I came across. I was pondering these three natures, and I ran this by Tsongtse Rinpoche, and he said, yes, this actually works. And I found this quite helpful in terms of understanding. On one hand, you have the imaginary nature, which is over to the left. And on the right, you have the perfectly existent nature. The imaginary nature, that's associated with samsara. The perfectly existent nature is associated with enlightenment. So as we practice the path, we move from the confusion of samsara to the clarity of enlightenment. And what is in fact taking place is that this whole, you could say, unit, which is, you could say, the dependent nature spans both the imaginary nature. It contains both the imaginary nature and the perfectly existent nature. So we could see it as one big block there, yeah? But within that, then as we eliminate confusion, and that's the white section where it says impure dependent nature, as we eliminate that, then more and more the pure dependent nature becomes manifest. And that's also where, say, the pure dependent nature is associated with what we call the kayas and wisdoms and all the qualities of Buddha nature that become increasingly manifest. So those of you who studied Madhyamika would remember the critique of the Yogacarya from the Prasangika Madhyamika is that the Yogacarya, they would say this dependent nature that exists for real, this reflexive awareness, that is something that's truly there. And its awakened condition is then the pure dependent nature. Its deluded nature is the impure dependent nature. So that's where we, and this also has to do with what we call pure and impure perceptions. So also there, you could say, as the bodhisattvas gradually eliminate their confusion, their obscurations, cognitive obscurations, emotional obscurations, then gradually their vision, their experience is increasingly then pure perception. So ordinary beings, they experience impure perception. Sublime beings experience pure perception. And as the bodhisattva progresses on the path, then more and more they have what we call then pure perception, experiencing more and more this pure dependent nature. So there's a lot of value in this, in the Yogacarya perspective, the Yogacarya teachings. So Vasubandhu, he was then a important commentator on the Abhidharma. He's somebody who converted to the yogic practice school. Vasubandhu was the younger brother of Sangha. And he did, you could say, he brought then, he wrote some important commentaries, the Abhidharma Kosha and so forth, commentaries on the Abhidharma, but then eventually, and he went actually to castigate his brother, Asanga, who was this Mahayana practitioner. And he was converted by Asanga to the yogi practice school. But he was very vocal in terms of analyzing and bringing the Abhidharma to the forefront of studies, and very much was someone who could present how everything we experience really is based on the primacy of mind, not matter. Our suffering, and again, this is the main sort of thrust of what we're discussing here, comes from viewing self and objects as solid. And a solid objective world is uniquely constructed by a mind that is supported by uniquely constructed by a mind that is supported by reasoning. So that view that we have the way that we see the world is entirely based on the one who's seeing. It's something that this is not mystical language. It's something we can establish with reason. This is very important. This is where reasoning is so important for us. And it's also reasoning that enables us to sort of cut the umbilical cord a little bit in terms of just expecting that someone else is going to save us. Once we begin to use reasoning, we can begin to have some independent assessment of the validity of what the Buddha is teaching. And when it comes to the primacy of mind, this is something that is also very basic to our understanding of the Vajrayana. When we're, like we looked at before, when we gradually uncover the pure dependent nature, we're gradually seeing everything in terms of purity. This is essentially the scope of reality when it's no longer confused. So that's where someone who sees pure perception is somebody whose view is in concordance with reality, is free from obscuration. But that is very much on the basis of understanding how we experience through this mind. Finally, then we have pramana, valid cognition. And this was essentially founded by someone called Nyingma, but particularly then the main expounder of the valid cognition, the pramana tradition, is Dharmakirti. Valid cognition is important because that's where we know that our knowledge is valid. So we could of course say, well, I'd like to think something, you know, it suits me to believe, you know, that the earth is flat because it looks like it's flat to me, and I'm just going to choose to believe that. But that's why we can say, well, that's appears like that, but actually if we investigate, the earth actually isn't flat. It is actually round. And that's where we then have various forms of measurement that enable us to see better. That's where we can speak about a valid science, and we can oppose that to a flawed science. So we want to make sure that our science is valid, not flawed. And that, of course, is a huge thing within our educational system, within our critically thinking culture, and so forth. And it's very often how modern people, they, for example, would disregard, say, the spiritual, because they would see, oh, but that's not valid science. And that's where the Buddhist teaching is so so not in agreement, because there's an equally valid science that has to do with the subjective dimension. So Dharmakirti is someone who, there's also something very significant about this. This very much comes from a place of compassion. You can see at the time of the Buddha, there was very much a period in which the main emphasis, the main cultural practice was very much the sort of simplistic, the simple and the simple renunciant style. But in the early centuries of the Common Era, there was in India a lot of, you could say, intellectual analysis, a lot of discussion that persists until the present day. If you visit India, Indians like to discuss philosophy, and mainly, you know, the Caucasians, white people, they like that too. I know for myself at least. But the point really is that there's an engagement of ideas, and that's where when you have two persons that are in dialogue, very often they both grow from that. They grow and have a greater understanding. Of course, they could just end up endlessly talking, and that's of course the danger. But at the same time, there's something very compassionate in masters like Dharmakirti who engaged. They didn't just go to the mountain saying, well, they're all wrong, I got it right, I don't want to talk to them, but actually compassionately engaging with their contemporaries. And that's where then the practice of pramana was very, very important in terms of understanding properly relative truth, understanding absolute truth. Anyway, Dharmakirti's system of, that's Danish there, og, but of valid cognition, epistemology, or pramana, same thing, establishes between universals, or distinguishes between universals, which is how we very often see things, and particulars. Okay, this is an interesting point, really. So when I, for example, say table, then we all know what I'm talking about. But if I then go and looking at a particular table, then actually I'm becoming closer to something that is quite specific. The moment that I'm looking at something, then I also realize that I'm actually creating a projection onto that thing. I'm not really touching the thing itself. And so if I, for example, have a particular attachment to this table, I'm seeing it differently from if I didn't. So we can identify how, in fact, we are projecting veils onto the object. And the system here is understanding how phenomena, they exist in terms of from their own side, free from our projections. And that's what we then call the svalakshana, or the particulars. That phenomena exist as they are without our projections. Universals are the degrees to which we project onto phenomena. So this is actually a big theme, and I won't dwell on that. But the point is that we have the ways in which we generate images when it comes to the particular objects of our knowledge, and that's where we actually don't really have proper knowledge. That's also why in science we put things under microscope. We analyze things to actually break through and try to identify the particular beyond the universal. So we have a general view of the world, which is then what from the view here is that it's unreal constructed universals. Objects themselves exist independently of such abstractions, which are real particulars. We recognize that our projections are invalid, that we're not seeing straight. That's the sort of the recognition that we have. This is also a theme within Western epistemology. And the cultivation of wisdom is then the dismantling of our belief in these projections. And that is what then frees us from our deluded projections. It simply does what enables us to see things clearer without our, you could say, stories, narratives, projections. So cultivation of wisdom then remedies our fixation on invalid beliefs in permanence, happiness, and self, where these are the three signs that we normally misunderstand. We think what is impermanent as permanent. We think what is in fact suffering, which is as I think it's happiness. And we think what doesn't have a self as having a self. So that's where that scientific approach that valid cognition offers us, and this is associated also with the tenet school called the Sotrantika. This enables us then to have a clearer, rational, logical understanding of the two truths and the nature of phenomena in general. So all of these are important points. Now, as far as Mipham Rinpoche goes, then he very much saw how all of these have value. They have value in terms of us understanding our reality. Now let's be really clear here. Mipham Rinpoche was above all a yogi. He was a sage. And like I mentioned last time, the writings that we have from Mipham Rinpoche, a bit like Longchen, but they're just sort of things that he wrote down in his post-meditation between sessions. But he did because for a number of reasons really, but he very much, in Tibet, there had very much evolved an intellectual scholastic tradition that very often produced certainty. And so that individuals who had clarity about the nature of, you could say, phenomena, understanding the two truths and so on, they would succeed very well in their meditation. Whereas sometimes you had a little bit the issue with what we call the dumb meditator. We have the extremes of the crazy intellectual and the dumb meditator, which is someone who then just sort of just sticks to a sort of very, you could say, unimaginative, just sort of, you know, basically following along without really a clear understanding. So that's where just meditating without a real clarity and certainty is not that helpful. So Mipham very much was about practice, but he wanted the practice to really be founded on clarity of the view, certainty in the view. The general approach of Tibetan Buddhism is that we combine, on one hand, and this is a big thing in Mipham you could say methodology, is the unity of valid cognition, pramana, and the Madhyamika, the consequent school. This is not the other Buddhist traditions that you have in Asia, not necessarily, doesn't really emphasize this. And we have then you could say a difference, for example, in the approach that you find in the Zen tradition and the tradition that you have in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. There's a lot to be said about that. But just here, we appreciate that Mipham Rinpoche's, you could say, main methodology was what he called Singha Jingyal, which means actually the entwinement of two lions. So if you imagine some long-necked lions, they sort of like just wrap around each other. They then have a complete view, both front and back. You could say they have their back covered, and as such, they're invincible. So these two, the valid cognition and the consequent school, are really viewed as, you could say, the lions that provide fearlessness. If you got the valid cognition and you have the consequent school, the Madhyamika, the view of Madhyamika, then you're good. One is establishing, you could say, one is the epistemological certainty of the validity of what you know, and the other is the ontological vision, knowing of reality as it is. So that actually has had a big impact down to the present day, this approach of Mipham Rinpoche. And of course, it's something that runs as a red thread through Tibetan Buddhism in general, but it's something that Mipham Rinpoche very much emphasized. So as such, Dharmakirti's epistemology, his pramana, and Chandrakirti's Madhyamika, the ontology, these works are very important to Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche's teachings. So likewise also his Shantarakshita synthesis of the middle way in the yogic practice school, what we then call the Yogacharya Svatantrika Madhyamika. These are essentially the view of Shantarakshita, and this is what we have in his teaching called the ornament of the middle way, is this approach that understands relative truth from the viewpoint of the Yogacharya and absolute truth from the viewpoint of the Madhyamika. So we're joining together some really big themes, but these are part of the neighborhood that we inhabit. Everything we're talking about here is reflected in the sadhanas that we practice. It's reflected in the instructions in meditation that we have. It's, you could say, permeates the whole neighborhood of the Buddha's teachings and all the great masters that have followed since. So these are really, you could say, the important building blocks of our culture of, you could say, the Buddhist path. So here then we have this little overview you have in the book. You can look at that for yourself, but essentially then you have Nagarjuna associated with the middle way, and you have a Sangha associated with the yogic practice school, Dharmakirti associated with valid cognition, Chandrakirti, the consequent school, and Shantarakshita, the yogic practice school of the middle way. So then you also have the chronology there. Anyway, Mipham Rinpoche, Duckworth says, Mipham Rinpoche shows how these five voices can be heard in harmony, not monotone. So they actually join together. They're not sitting each in their end of the room, sort of like, clamoring to be heard, but they join in and, constitute a beautiful choir. All right. So chapter 3. So Buddhist identity in Tibet. Now, this also is something that many of us have heard in terms of the history, but here more interesting is really the ideas that have shaped, you could say, and the important characters that have shaped the present practice culture that we are heirs to that. We are inheritors of that. So Duckworth here, opening the chapter, says, Mipham, okay, I have a hard time with that. One of my friends was speaking about Mipham Rinpoche, and he had been reading Duckworth. So he says, he was speaking with Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, and he was saying, yeah, well, Mipham's view. And Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche went, Mipham? Who's that? Mipham? And my friend was getting sort of a bit frustrated and flustered. Well, Mipham, Mipham, the student of Khyentse Wangpo and so on. Oh, you mean Jamgön Mipham? So there's a general sense of veneration in you could say, in our living culture of the lineage to, it's not just Mipham. Like sometimes you'll hear people say, oh yeah, Tsongsa. Yeah, I watched that video with Tsongsa, We don't really, as students, we there's this famous story, Geshe Gaon Dagye. He tells this story about how this person came to see Je Tsongkhapa, and he asked, is Je Tsongkhapa in the room? And this nun who was there, she sort of lit a stick of incense, and then she's sort of holding the incense. She says, yes, the Lord Je Tsongkhapa is residing here. She wouldn't say his name just like that. And we very often see in the Tibetan writings, we see he whose name is hard to mention. And I will tell you from personal experience, even Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, when he would sometimes mention the name of Milarepa, or he would mention the name of Longchenpa, he would choke up. He would say, just from. And I also heard Dingmu Khyentse Rinpoche sometimes when he was talking about Shiching Gyaltsab, for example, or Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, would have the same thing. So anyway, Jamgön Mipham belongs to the Nyingma, literally the old school tradition. The Nyingma school identifies itself with the early transmission of Buddhism to Tibet in the 8th century, in contrast to the Sama or new schools. This was the era when the Dharma king Trisong Detsen invited Chantarakshita and Padmasambhava to Tibet. Chantarakshita, who was the proponent of the yogic practice school of the Middle Way, played a central role in shaping the form of Buddhism in Tibet. He was a great scholar, but his tradition of sutra scholarship was not sufficient to tame the wild land of Tibet, so the master of Tantra, Padmasambhava, was called on. This interplay of sutra and tantra, a prominent element in Mipham's works, has been an important theme in Tibet since early times. So that is where you see this great pragmatism of the rationality of the sutra teachings and the wisdom, the yoga of the mantra teachings working together. Yeah. So following the debate at Samye, where there was a showdown really between, you could say, the Zen or rather Chan tradition and then the tradition, the gradualist tradition of the Indian approach. That's where then the Tibetans adopted the Indian gradual path. So that's where you can see there's a slightly different flavor between Chan Buddhism and the Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, but significantly, they're all part of the Mahayana and all, you say, essentially trace back to the same sources. Anyway, Mahamudra and Mahasandhi, which of course we could say, well, it resembles the Zen tradition, but not really. They all practice amanasikara or non-thought meditation. Yet both the Mahamudra and Mahasandhi, they have a gradual approach, and that also involves the development of the view based on reason. So Mipham Rinpoche highlighted the value of joining analysis and meditation, what we call establishing the view with certainty as a foundation for meditation. Now, the old and new schools, the Nyingma ancient tradition emerged within the 8th century, which in the context of the imperial court, Trisong Detsen's court. The founders there were the abbot, Shantarakshita, who we just mentioned, the acharya, Padmasambhava, and the king, Trisundetsen. Now, with the demise of the empire, which was about 100 years later, the teachings lost their political and institutional ground. And this is where we see the collapse of the great Tibetan Empire with the King Nangdharma, who was then assassinated. Then the Nyingma teachings continued, but not necessarily in a monastic context. Then, about a century and a half later, from Western Tibet, there emerged then the new schools of translation, beginning with someone called the translator Rinchen Zanpo and George Palden Atisha, which were the Kadampa schools, and then the Sakya and Kagyu traditions. These, by the way, the Sakya and Kagyu traditions didn't come from the Western Tibet. I apologize. But they came rather from central and southern Tibet. Anyway, in the context of the emergence of the new tradition, then the Nyingma teachings became viewed with suspicion, prompting the defenses of Rongzom. And that's why we read about it here. Douglas Duckworth talks about it, and Rongzom's role really, and his absolute brilliance. If you read some of Rongzom Pandita's writings, absolute brilliance in terms of clarifying the teachings of the Nyingma, the Mahayoga, the great perfection teachings, and so on. So the scriptures such as the Guhyagarbha Tantra were ultimately validated as authentic Indian Tantra. That is really you could say the foundation of the Nyingma inner three tantras is the Guhyagarbha Tantra. And that was criticized by the new Sama school, saying, oh, yeah, this is some sort of, they've just written that. But eventually, actually, there was found Sanskrit originals. And when Atisha came to Samye, he was deeply impressed with all the original Sanskrit tantras that were kept at Samye, at the library there. So the content. Now, why Guhyagarbha Tantra is important, and this is where Duckworth is so important, because he never moves away from actually explaining why is this important. The Guhyagarbha Tantra is very important because it essentially establishes the view of pure perception. It shows us how samsara never moves from the ground of wisdom. We would say how mind and wisdom never separate. And this shifts the view on Buddha nature from being a potential to being an immediate reality. What we're talking about in terms of pure perception is just the way things actually are. If only we would just look properly, see clearly. Rongzom Pandita, then he wrote two important commentaries on the Guhyagarbha Tantra. One is the Nangwa Sadrup, the establishing appearances as divine, translated presently into English by Heidi Koppel, and entering the way of the great vehicle, Tekshin Tsuljuk, translated by Dominic Sur. So based on these, Jamgön Mipham expounded this on the basis of his conventional valid cognition of pure perception. And that's where Mipham establishes what we call relative truth. In its actual nature is deity and mantra, is actually a mandala. On the basis of essentially understanding the unity of appearance and emptiness as it permeates our relative perceptions, and as such never moves from the original ground of purity. And this is the scope of sublime beings. And so this is what's called the valid cognition, not just the valid cognition, sort of like, 2 + 2 is 4, seeing things properly, but actually understanding truly how things are. This constitutes, you could say, an epistemologically valid perspective on reality. It's, if you like, a scientific view on reality, and that's the foundation for pure vision. So again, pure vision here is not just imagining things are something that they're not, but really about understanding things as they actually are. So Mipham, he contrasted this to Dharmakirti's conventional valid cognition of confined perception. So one is pure vision, seeing clearly, but there's also sort of the way that we see things on the basis of our karmic vision. And that's why you also have, say, something, we have a valid cognition. We understand how things operate. 2 + 2 is 4. 2 + 2 is not 5. 5 would be, you could say, invalid. So that's where within our ordinary world, we operate within a science that applies, and that everything that we, for example, in the modern world, sort of hugely respect and venerate, really what we call science, is essentially all science that operates within this confined perception, within a confined science. But so we have these two kind of pramana in terms of relative truth, and this is where Mipham he brings together the view of the sutras, which operates with the valid cognition of confined perception, and the view of the mantra, which is understanding the valid cognition of pure vision. So equally epistemically valid, if you like. Now, I'm a bit confused with Duckworth using the word sect, which has always been a little bit of a difficult word in my vocabulary, but yeah, anyway, the schools, traditional lineages, anyway, you have these Buddhist sects in Tibet, and there you have particularly some remarkable eras. And while the early era of Tibetan Buddhism, you could say, continued, and actually there's a lot of extraordinary, you could say, extraordinary practitioners, extraordinary great masters. But there is then a time then where we have some very important masters, and these are then the ones we're looking at here. Longchen Rabjam from the Nyingma tradition, a great master who expounded the Dzogchen tradition. Dolpopa Sherab Gyaltsen, a great master of the Kala Chakra and the Jonang tradition. Tsongkhapa Losam Chapa, a great master of the Madhyamika and the Mahayana, who's the founder of the Gelug tradition. And then the Gorampa Sonam Sengye, a great Sakya master, who was very important in terms of clarifying also the view of the middle way, particularly according then to the Sakya tradition. Now, these masters then, first of which is Longchenpa. Longchenpa, we're going to be, referring to some works in this chapter and also the following chapter that are significant, and you could say constant reference point. Like I've said before, if we're living in this world, it's good to know that there's Africa, there's South America, there's Asia, Europe, the Americas, what have you, and so we just know our way around. So similarly, also our, you say, culture, the culture to which we belong, and that really is the foundation for everything we're doing in terms of the path. It has some very important reference point, and some of these are important works by important masters. And so every once in a while, there might be reading transmissions given or teachings on these particular teachings, and that's where we would know, it would be really good to receive these empowerments, these particular teachings, and so on. They very much contribute to clarifying our view and very much carry with them tremendous blessing, tremendous power in terms of inspiring and enhancing our practice. So when it comes to Longchenpa, some significant works there include the Heart Essence in 4 parts, what we call the Nyingti Gyaltsen, the 7 Treasuries, the Dzödön, the Trilogy of Rest in Gyaltsen Korsun. And in terms of Mipham Rinpoche, then we would say Longchenpa was particularly important for Mipham Rinpoche. And sometimes Mipham Rinpoche would refer to Longchenpa and Rongsom together as the Kunchen Ronglong, the omniscient Rongsom and the omniscient Longchenpa, and very much as these as being sort of his guiding lights in terms of the Buddhist teaching. Then we have Dolpopa Sherab Gyaltsen, the founder of the Jonang tradition, and he particularly was what we call Shentong. He very much would say, well, there's the emptiness of all the samsaric phenomena, but nirvanic phenomena, they're for real. And he would say the main teaching of the Buddha is the 3rd turning of the wheel that asserts Buddha nature. So that was quite radical, and he sort of copped a bit of critique here and there. Anyway, Mipham Rinpoche actually appreciates the Shentong view, and also, for example, someone like Jamgön Kongtrul very much. And so, while Mipham Rinpoche would generally refer to himself as what's called a Rangtong, somebody who, you could say, asserts emptiness universally, then he also appreciated the valid point that came from Dolpopa. And Dolpopa's writings are regarded as incredibly profound and important. But the tradition had a little bit of a hard time in Tibet. Didn't quite find the public support it might have needed. Tsongkhapa is the father of the Gelug tradition, and he very much is someone who, you could say, reformulated and emphasized the Prasangika consequent school view. So Mipham Rinpoche, he agreed with his emphasis on, you could say, knowledge and certainty in establishing the view, the emphasis on reasoning. But as we'll also be revisiting, Mipham Rinpoche didn't always agree with some of Tsongkhapa's views, or he would say maybe for skillful, the Tibetans are very, you could say, diplomatic in their presentation, and he would say, according to the particular needs of sentient beings, possibly you could say this, but there are certain problems with some other perspectives, and they could be misinterpreted and so forth. So there was a bit of polite refutation of some of Tsongkhapa's views. Gorampa, he was a bit less polite, and he was very critical of Tsongkhapa's view, and particularly Tsongkhapa's view on non-affirmative negation. Essentially, Gorampa would say he ended up having a nihilist view and so forth. So there was a bit of Gorampa. He was copped again a little bit of a critique from, you could say, official quarters for some centuries. Anyway, Jamgön Rinpoche was very much someone who sought to synthesize the view of both the Dolpopa view and the Dolpopa's Shentong view and Tsongkhapa's Rangtong view. And he very much adopted a way in which these two apparently opposing views, they could be understood to actually be complementary. Now, this all emerged in a situation in which particularly for the Nyingma that initially had been held on the Nyingma were interesting because they were very decentralized, not very institutionalized, in many cases held in terms of family lineages and so forth. But under the influence of the Gelug tradition and from the 5th Dalai Lama onwards, there was such an emphasis on monasticism in Tibet that the Nyingma also began to, you could say, establish these monastic centers. So that's where, while there was a dominance that came with that monasticism, you could say this highly institutionalized approach of the Gelug, they also dominated the discourse. And that's where the Gelug sometimes found themselves, you could say, a little bit sort of, there would be some, you could say, reactions in various quarters. And there was a little bit of, you could say, retreating into rather rigid positions. But some of these were associated with political factors. And again, the Nyingma being very decentralized and very apolitical, they actually stood in a very good way to actually promote this non-sectarian approach. And so even within the Gelug tradition, then the Gelug masters sometimes would listen to some of the Nyingma masters. Famously, the 5th Dalai Lama was a student of Mindraling Therak Lingpa, and also somebody called Lhochak Drupchen and other Nyingma masters. Anyway, as you could say the situation evolved and monasticism became increasingly common, then 6 main Nyingma monasteries emerged: 2 in central Tibet, Mindraling and Dorjijak, and 4 in eastern Tibet, Katok, Payul, Shichen, and Dzogchen. Now, in that context, really, where the mainstream more and more was the monastic institutions, with also with a lot of emphasis on, you could say, the monastic universities or colleges. Then there was a lot of, you could say, appropriation of the Gelug, the Gelug methods and the Gelug view, and that's where there was essentially a hegemony, a domination, a discursive domination of the Gelug, and that's where Mipham Rinpoche, and like we saw earlier, very much at the behest of Jamgön Khyentse Wangpo, he then wrote out and established the particular Nyingma view. So Douglas Duckworth, he writes, Mipham's works, particularly on the middle way, were taken as attacks on the Gelug tradition, even though he himself expressed immense respect for Tsongkhapa and, in significant ways, drew on important aspects of Tsongkhapa's thought in his interpretation. So the monastic college is a non-sectarian movement, Rime being this non-sectarian movement. The Rime movement emerged as non-Gelug traditions identified the importance of recognizing the values of all the lineages, namely the 8 practice lineages of what we call the Drupgyu Shinta Gye. So that's where the Gelug traditions very much were, you could say, establishing a hegemony, you could say, rather monolithic and dominant, essentially, dominant sort of approach to the Buddhist teaching. Then there was a number of lineages that the Rime movement really celebrated as important. And that, of course, also included the Kadampa teachings of the Gelug tradition. So it wasn't anti-Gelug in any way, but it really identified how all the various traditions had a particular value. And so we generally talk about the 4 main traditions, but here in this context and in the Rime movement, we talk about 8 particular lineages. Anyway, Mipham Rinpoche was very prominent in this because he had that view on how all these different teachings actually work beautifully together. So in that way, the Nyingma, who increasingly had adopted this monastic style of the colleges, they, with their also appropriation of Gelug material, then they were, according to Khyentse Wangpo, then they needed really to have a clear Nyingma view, which was being lost because there was very particular views that were taught in terms of the sutra teachings, particularly that we have from the likes of Shantarakshita, from Ronsom Pandita, and particularly those two. And there was, to develop this, you could say, unique Nyingma and also Kagyu curriculum. There was 2 important masters. One was then Mipham Rinpoche, but also somebody called Khenpo Shenga. And they established these numerous monastic colleges. It's said that Mipham established 25 colleges, and Khenpo Shenga established 19 monastic colleges. So on the basis of, for example, from the Katok monastery, we had these 25 sub colleges, and I know that in Tsongsa monastery, the Tsongsa Tashi Hladze, I think this was established by Khenpo Shenga. And he also then established many others. Anyway, Douglas Duckworth says, before the 19th century, the Nyingma tradition was mainly defined by its interpretation and practice of Tantra, in particular the secret essence Tantra, the Guhyagarbha Tantra. The institutional transformation of the Nyingma tradition that began in the 17th century and continued into the 19th and 20th century was a complex process of systematization, domestication of the tantric vision of divine unity, systematization or domestication of the tantric vision of divine unity. So that's why you could say the teachings that we have from the Guhyagarbha Tantra, which is very much the scope of the tantric view, which was also then associated with, you could say, tantric practice, was very much then, you could say, ushered in as something that could be applied in a monastic context and also aligned with the sutra teachings, something that Ronsom Pandita had done, Longchenpa also, but particularly then Mipham Rinpoche made a tremendous contribution in that regard. So then Duckworth continues, before this time, the Nyingma tradition was more of a meditative, ritual, and contemplative tradition centered on the mystical vision of Tantra. Mipham's work is a product of the synergy between the wild divine world of Tantra and the rational analytic rigor of the newly founded monastic colleges in his tradition. A little bit about Khenpo Shenga. So Khenpo Shenga was a prominent student of Paltram Rinpoche. If you read Enlightened Vagabond, there's some beautiful some beautiful stories about how Paltram looked after Khenpo Shenga. And you say Khenpo Shenga's journey. But particularly, Khenpo Shenga was famous for teaching this, what we call Rangtong or Shentong, and he taught at the Papo monastery, which was the seat of, well, the Sita Rinpoches, but also Jamgön Kongtrul. And Jamgön Kongtrul was very much a Shentong or other emptiness person. So there was some, as the Duckworth describes, there was a little bit of controversy. And also, Dingun Chinsa Rinpoche studied with Khenpo Shenga. So we have some notes there also. Anyway, he's an important person along with Mipham Rinpoche. Now, the Nyingma colleges, as we've seen, then relied heavily on Gelug and Sakya commentary. The Nyingma colleges relied heavily on Gelug and Sakya commentaries. You have that remark on essentially the Dorub monasteries. They would very much rely on the Gelug commentaries. The Kato monastery would rely on the Sakya commentaries. So Mipham Rinpoche composed these commentaries that clearly defined the Nyingma view. And Khenpo Shenga, likewise, even though he was both sort of Nyingma and Kaji, but he very much relied on the original Indian works. So he went straight back to the source, if you like. And so Douglas Duckworth says, in the colophon of his interlinear commentary on the introduction to the Middle Way, Khenpo Shenga states that he wrote his commentary without mixing even a hair of the individual opinion of the Tibetan masters. So that's where he sort of sidestepped any, you can say, bickering that had emerged over the centuries. Duckworth says, despite the distinctive interpretive styles of Jamgön Kongtrul, Khenpo Shenga and Mipham, despite the distinctive interpretive styles of Jamgön Kongtrul, Khenpo Shenga and Mipham, there is a tendency to fuse them together within what has been called the non-sectarian or remade tradition. We should keep in mind that the term non-sectarian, as applied to diverse positions in this way, is multivalent. It certainly does not refer to a single system of interpretation. Also, it does not mean that all traditions are necessarily taken as equal on all levels. Rather, a general quality of what it means to be non-sectarian in Tibet is an attitude of respectful engagement with a broad range of competing Buddhist traditions of interpretation. So this is where the Rime approach is very much one of, you could say, essentially appreciating the richness of the various traditions. Duckworth then says, thus we can understand what came to be known as the non-sectarian movement as a broad set of traditions stemming from Eastern Tibet in the 19th century that developed a common interest in preserving a variety of Buddhist traditions as a response to the singular dominance of the Gelug school. So we say that Tsongkhapa's teachings, they spread very widely all over to Tibet to the extent that it sort of was beginning to sort of outshine or overshadow some of the other traditions. So again, here we have some persons here that are significant in this discussion, their names, their particular affiliations, and the dates and so on. So you have that within the book, but of course, yes, it's Rongsum Longchenpa Döpa Tsongkhapa that we've looked at here, Paltram Rinpoche as well, Jamgön Khyentse Wangpo, Jamgön Kongtrul, and Khenpo Shenga. So but this is pretty self-explanatory, and you have that in the text. Now, as a result then of this Rime spirit, a renewed appreciation of great masters emerged at this time. And this actually is important because thanks to Mipham Rinpoche, then all of a sudden there was a renewed interest in studying Longchenpa. And he edited and oversaw printing of his works and so on, also writing a catalog of Longchenpa's works. Gorampa Sonam Sengye actually was, then, during some centuries, it was forbidden to actually print his works because he was a bit rude with Tsongkhapa. I think he mentioned something about Tsongkhapa must be seized by a demon or something like that. Yeah, so that's where the sort of the dominant Gelug sort of rulership authorities, they didn't appreciate that. So Gorapa was essentially banned until the early 20th century. I don't think this was the case of Karmapa Micho Dorje, but anyway, he was also somebody whose works were then, say, approached with renewed vigor and studied in depth. Now, just sort of on the last note here is just what happened in Tibet was that in the 19th century, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, in the sort of mid 1800s, there was a great chieftain from a place called Nyarong, which is in eastern Tibet. The people there are quite tough. Chagda Rinpoche was from Nyarong. Chatur Rinpoche was from Nyarong. And they pride themselves as being rather the toughest of the tough Kampas. But anyway, Gompo Namgyal, who was this chieftain, was a very brutal and very fierce and very ambitious chieftain who basically conquered a lot of the sort of local fiefdoms and so on. And to the extent then that the central Tibetan army came into Kham. And this is where there was some upheavals and so forth. It's at that time also that Mipham Rinpoche, he traveled to central Tibet and visited Lhasa and so on, just to get out of harm's way. At that time also you had the Chinese who were moving into Kham and Amdo. This was during the Qing dynasty, but then in 1911, with the end of the Qing dynasty, then the China basically withdrew, and from 1911, and this is also where you had this meeting in India where there was meeting between, I think, the Chinese and the British. They gave Tibet this sort of what they call suzerainty, that they gave them some degree of independence. And so until then, the emergence of Mao Zedong in the late 40s and early 50s, then you could say the Tibetans were relatively undisturbed by Chinese presence. But of course, what happened both in Tibet and in China itself is under the brutal sort of regime of Mao Zedong, and particularly then the Cultural Revolution, then so much destruction happened. And this is, of course, we know about all the tragedies of Tibet, but we should never forget what happened in China itself as well. You can try and read the Wild Swans of Yung Chan and others. This was universally tragic. Nevertheless, and what is important for us here in this particular discussion is really that Mipham Rinpoche's work survived and continues. And these pictures here are actually two places where Mipham Rinpoche's works are studied widely. One is a place, they're both in Kham. One is Larungar, near a place called Serta in Golo. And I don't know if you can see these pictures, but there was both of these centers. One was under was founded. Larungar was founded by a great master called Jigme Punso, a great master incarnation of Tetun Sogyal, Lerab Lingpa, and someone who would actually have visions of Mipham. There's actually treasure teachings on the basis of Khenpo Jigpön, as he was called, his visions of Mipham Rinpoche. Another great master was somebody called Khenpo Akchuk, who was a great master, also in the tradition of Longchen Pa and Mipham Rinpoche, and also a great Tatun himself. He founded this place called Yachengar. Both of these centers, they actually count as having something like 10,000 inhabitants. Both monks and nuns inhabit these places, and also many Chinese would come and study in these places. But this is up until the present day. These are all pictures that are taken recently. In both cases, particularly Larungar has been destroyed, and it's been actually Larungar was destroyed on several occasions, just simply because the Chinese authorities felt uncomfortable with such a large gathering, and similarly also Yachengar. So I'm not sure what the situation is these days, because very often what happens in this context is that the official stance is this needs to be destroyed, but then people very sort of gently, without really going and demonstrating in front of the government, They just quietly reassemble, and you can say, basically, they continue. So it's a little bit sort of like, water. You splash into water, and then water just comes back to where it was. So I don't know what the situation is in Larunga or Yachinga these days, but certainly the impact of Mipham Rinpoche is enormous due to these great monastic centers. And for example, we have great Khenpos like Khenpo Sodaje and Khenpo Tsultem Lodre, who both are from Larunga, who travel and teach, and also teach within China, and also teaching in the Western world. I know Khenpo Tsultem Lodre has taught at Harvard, and also he came to Australia, taught in University of Queensland, also down in Sydney, and Khenpo Sodaje also teaches online, and so they have a lot of activity. But again, this is continually sort of again and again repressed by the Chinese authorities. Anyway, these are then the you could say the present day situation, in which you could say very much that Mipham Rinpoche's work is still studied, discussed, analyzed, and essentially serves as the foundation for the view of practice. Okay. No questions? This is the end here, yeah. Next time, please read chapter 4, Survey of Mipham's Works. You're very welcome to ask questions if you like. But of course, in some way, this is just a lot of information. So anyway, I'm very happy that you're here and studying this. I think this is, we shouldn't think this is just academic study. This is something that really creates a profound sense of foundation, a profound sense of the validity of the path. And this really becomes the foundation for faith. And that, of course, faith, of course, takes us further beyond just the rational. But the rational can serve, this is the point I often repeat, how Songsa Khyentse Rinpoche, he said to me, the highest role of philosophy is that it really provides faith. And then with faith, there is this openness in which we can truly sort of engage with the blessing of the teacher and the lineage. By this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death, from this ocean of samsara, may I liberate beings. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all my lives, may I remain at your lotus feet, and study, reflect, and meditate on your texts again and again. Grant your blessings that I will hold, protect, and spread your teachings to the limit of space for as long as samsara lasts. This last verse comes from a great Khenpo who was a student of somebody called Pertrul Tempe Nyingma, who again was somebody who was very important in upholding Mipham Rinpoche's teachings. So Khenpo Tsundra, who passed away in April 19, no, not April. He passed away on the 18th of the 12th month in 1979, I think January or February, as he was expounding the Prajna chapter from the Way of the Bodhisattva in front of Devukha Rinpoche. He just keeled over. A very great master, what more auspicious way to go. So he wrote these last 4 lines. Khenpo Tsundra. Okay. Thank you very much. See you next week.